O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again, section 36. We have discussed the value circle, the problem that we are always already using and living according to values, of which then raises a problem on how we could, say, determine our own values, by what standard we can determine our own values, all these different paradoxes, which alludes and suggests the work of Samuel Barnes in Missing Axioms, which I think is a magnificent text. And we've also talked about the conflict of society, which aligns with the conflict of mind. And the conflict of mind is when epistemic responsibility comes in conflict with epistemic possibility. The conflict of society is when social responsibility comes in conflict with social possibility. And these society basically managed the problem of the value circle, the problem of the conflict of society with Givens, with the Hannah Arendt thoughtlessness, which is not stupidity, but a certain state of absorbing your worldview. And now we have a problem where, the Givens have collapsed, and therefore the conflict of society has been unleashed into our conscious awareness, and the problem of the value circle is now unleashed into our conscious awareness. And the previous sections allude to this issue. In this part of the book, there's a kind of turn, you could say, to the question of, all right, well, how do we develop as individuals in such a manner that can handle all of the tensions we now find ourselves in without being overwhelmed by them, and thus, in that state of existential overwhelm, turn to a totalitarian strongman. Terms have been used through the book like Overmen, Nietzsche, Deleuzian Individuals, absolute knowers. And all of these terms, these are all, I'm not saying these terms are all the same. I'm not saying Hegel and Deleuze are exactly the same, or Nietzsche and Hegel are the same. But it seems like all of these thinkers are getting at something similar, something I would sum up as AB, the AB individual, which then gets into the science of logic by Hegel. So the book will go through different terms. And indeed, it would seem as if we as individuals have to find identity and relate to other people precisely on terms of the impossibility of a grounding of our values, the grounding of society, and to somehow find that an impossibility as a negation that sublates us in a new kind of being, a new kind of society, a society of absolute knowing. This is quite difficult, but indeed, if Hegel was correct with the science of logic that we needed to update logic from Aristotle in order to really think the now and to tarry with the now, tarry with the present, there's a way in which we now have to update the logical and metaphysical foundations of society from something that's less of a ground, and something that has a lot more to do with becoming other, with identifying with otherness in intersuppositionalness, which I've talked about with Cadell and Guy and different people. Nicholas Berdyaev, he's an interesting Russian philosopher and theologian. I think he suggests the tension between Givens and releases quite well. He says something like, the purely spiritual and moral problems of life arise only when man is outwardly free. Then the tragedy is no longer in conflict of personality with its social environment, but is transferred to the inner spiritual life. A free man, whose moral judgments are not dictated by the community in which he lives, is faced with an inner conflict of values and with the necessity of making a free and creative choice. I think this can be aligned with Nietzsche's child. I think this can be aligned with absolute knowing in Hegel. This is, though, very, very difficult. This is quite a burden. Nietzsche speaks about this extensively, and it will ultimately lead to the necessity of intrinsic motivation. Aristotle famously has that line where he says that a man without society is either a monster or a god. Well, basically, if the social order as traditionally understood is no longer possible, it's almost like everyone now must be a kind of god/monster, a kind of bothness, a kind of Schrodinger's cat. And if we can learn to integrate with this paradoxical tension, then perhaps we can be more godlike than monster-like, more Dante's beatific vision than the Lovecraft creatures. And I think it very often comes back to that great problem, to that great choice between those different things, of which is contingent upon how we respond to the awareness of the conflict of society, the awareness of the value circle, the awareness of the lack of being, and how we come to terms with those things. And the book will now begin to explore the topic of character through the lens of, say, Hunter. What is character? People talk about people not having character anymore today. Well, what exactly is character? Is it possible anymore? And it would seem as if, part of like having character day is precisely learning to deal with paradox and to identify with paradox and not be overwhelmed by it. Like a character is someone of whom in a situation of being a god/monster ends up more of a god. And what's interesting is, where Aristotle said outside of society is where gods and monsters are found. It's almost like now you have to have a society in which everyone relates to one another as this dual double potentiality of godlikeness or monster-likeness. Another term for it, which may be better, Doc Cadell will talk about alien. We have to become alien today, and there's the anthology Enter the Alien, which goes into depth on this, and I totally agree with it. Cadell has a really great paper on the problem where in the 21st century there's something essentially alien about human beings and has to be accepted and lived with and addressed. And I think that is the case, precisely because the alienness of the human being can no longer be hidden from him or her, because the conflict of society and the value circle can no longer be hidden. And so we have to be consciously aware. And once you're aware of that concept, well, that transforms how you to yourself is conceptually mediated. And that poses a lot of challenges in having to dialectically work through and wrestle with negativity. Cadell Last talks about this a lot with his work on the science of logic, and I think it is extremely accurate. The section will also talk about the person of Jesus, who I actually think is a fascinating, especially when you consider it in line with the Grand Inquisitor of Dostoevsky, which is one of the most remarkable works of literature ever written. And how Jesus upsets the very order. You basically almost need like a Jesus to come back today to upset Christianity as it has come to define itself and make itself ideologically comfortable with. And that makes me think of the work of Peter Rollins or something like that. But a way to frame it, Jesus does not answer the Grand Inquisitor when the Grand Inquisitor says, we're going to crucify you because you gave the world freedom and we can't handle freedom. And there's a kind of character in not responding to the Grand Inquisitor, and there's a kind of character here in this kind of weird giving man something they cannot bear, and yet standing by that decision. There's something that's extremely charactered about Jesus, and we are indeed seeing some kind of character that arises in paradoxical situations, and it often stands outside of what is socially comfortable, as you see with Thomas More. He's standing against what the king and the social order is doing. Well, if there's a way in which the social order is traditionally understood as no more, then maybe it's the case that only character can save us, because everyone is kind of outside of the social order, and therefore the new society is people that don't fit in a social order, and you make a social order out of people that don't fit simply into a social order. Well, that seems like a contradiction, and maybe it is. Maybe it's an impossibility. This has to be explored. It has to be explored on what exactly it would look like to have a society of people of who are not reducible to that society, who really are Nietzschean children, and who are somehow able to relate to one another as Nietzschean children and not become so imperceptible that they're obscure. I know Justin Murphy has talked about how in Deleuze one wants to be imperceptible but not obscure. That's a very difficult line to balance, though. And would it be possible for human beings to be unique and imperceptible in the sense that they cannot be controlled by the system, only known in their individuality through relationship, without becoming obscure to one another? And if they're too obscure, you may end up in a very atomized society, maybe like you see in Japan, where no one is having babies, social capital is gone, and arguably these things are happening in America as well. So these are a lot of the tensions, these are a lot of the questions, and the book will explore what is character, what does it mean, and is that a route by which we can go down, because that seems to be increasingly, when we start talking about an AB society, seems to be a society where the individual takes upon themselves a whole lot of existential tension and actually sees that as a good thing. They sublate it into a force of creative possibility and a new kind of world. Indeed, in Hegel, there is a kind of progress. If we have a future, it seems to be better than the past, but there's no guarantee that there's a future. And progress happens, as Cadell has put it, progress happens because of facing paradox and facing negativity. Progress is not a result of facing good things or facing niceties. It's a result of facing problems, and any of those problems could be the end of us. Just because the future will be better if it occurs doesn't mean it will occur. And it would seem that part of our challenge today to have a future is to figure out how to make communities of absolute knowing, communities of Nietzschean children. But what does that look like? How do we go about that? And to get into all of that, more analysis on the question of character seems warranted. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. For more Belonging Again, you can find the list on Medium and the playlist on YouTube. And thank you so much for your time.